Hello, hello. Looks like everything's working correctly. Sorry there, I had some technical difficulties for a minute. Ben, can you hear me? Alright, very good. Yeah, so I don't know what exactly happened. I accidentally went live when I wasn't ready to, so I had to reset everything so it would work correctly. So I'll probably wait a good 2 or 3 minutes before getting started with everything, reading the text. So yeah, I'll just kind of go ahead and start with some generic disclaimers. So first off, hello everybody. This is my first live stream. I'm doing a close reading of the Book of Matthew. So this is session 1 of the Book of Matthew. The goal is to go through the entire New Testament. So from Matthew all the way to the end of Revelation. Who knows how long that's going to take us. It could be a very long while, but we're going to get started today at least. So that's pretty exciting. I am not a professional biblical scholar of any sorts. So I may make some mistakes. Most of these takes are just things coming off the top of my head as we read through, trying to see what does the words that Jesus speaks and that the writers write on the page, what do those words tell us? The translations that I'm using, I think for this one, I'm going to be using NIV for the slides. I may look around and choose a different translation, a different version for other later streams. But then the main source that I'm also using is my Greek, English, and Interlinear New Testament. So this is it's a copy of the New Testament both in English and then also in the Greek with a direct translation from the Greek. So that's also something I'm going to be using a lot so that we can kind of get literal interpretations of what these words actually mean on their own, and that's something else that'll be helpful to examine more structure. I do know some Greek, so that's another bonus. I know kind of some of the ways that Greek grammar works and stuff, so hopefully I'll be able to use some of that knowledge through this. I'm probably going to go ahead and get started in just a minute. So this first session, we're going to try to get through the whole genealogy of Jesus. But I think because I only just started with YouTube, my streams can only go up to an hour maybe. So we're going to try to cut it off. Try to cut it off at 45, 50, 55 minutes. So if we don't get through the whole genealogy, we'll just pick it up in the next video. Once again, sorry if things seemed a little bit wonky. The stream, I had accidentally started it beforehand, and then I had to close it and restart it again, and so you may not have gotten like the correct notification to anybody who's watching this now or after the fact. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we're starting off, this is Matthew chapter 1, and then these are verses 1 through 6. Oh wait, did it cut off a little bit of that bottom verse? Interesting. Okay. So I'll first read it, just the NIV, and then probably I'll also read the Greek interlinear version, and then we'll start taking some notes and seeing what we can find. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. So then in the Greek, so the very direct, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Judah and the brothers of him. And Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Aram, and Aram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon. And Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David the king. So, one of the first things you probably notice right off the bat is that the New Testament and the book of Matthew, the entire thing begins with a genealogy. That's the very first thing probably jumps out to you, is like, this is a weird way to start this book, right? This is a little bit odd. Who starts with a record of names and a genealogy of lineage? I think it's interesting that he starts it off and kind of gives a very straight overview. Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Like, those are the 2 points that Matthew seems to be really stressing, is like, Jesus is the Messiah, and we can know this because he is the son of David and the son of Abraham. Something that's interesting about that is that he is the son of David and the son of Abraham, and that's because the Hebrew, or well, actually Greek word for like son could be just descendant. So something that is interesting is some of these people may not be direct descendants. It might be grandkids or great-grandkids. So Jesus the Messiah, the descendant of David, the descendant of Abraham. But it's very interesting, though, that this is how he wants to start his text. One thing that is noteworthy is that to the Jewish people, we know that genealogies were a lot more important to them. Genealogies in general seem to be important to most past cultures, right? I feel like today we don't really pay as much attention as we used to in the past, but even today there's a lot of people who are really interested in, like, there's these new things, you know, that you can put in blood samples and tests and all these things and find out where you're from and who you're related to and stuff. So I think even today we still see the value of that, but back then I think especially so. And for someone like Jesus who has, David the king, especially in his lineage, it's particularly important. Something else I noticed while researching was actually that word of the genealogy of Jesus Christ is like a direct parallel to the way that Genesis opens up. Genealogy and Genesis, that's, I think, the same root word. So it's the genesis of Jesus the Messiah, in the same way that the beginning of the Bible begins with the genesis of the whole earth and the genesis of mankind in general. So there's definitely something to, if you've read the book of John, you probably would notice, like, there's a similarity there to that he's trying to start the story off with a direct parallel back to the Old Testament, right? And they go about it in different ways, but both of them are making that conclusion very frank from the get-go. So if anybody is on the chat and you guys have any thoughts, I feel like that's something I should have said at the beginning. I kind of forgot. This is going to be like a live read and live discussion, and if you have any thoughts or any questions, about this passage, go ahead and put them out. I think I kind of wonder, like, what do most people feel about this genealogy? I think, to me, what's always most interesting is that he starts at Abraham. Like, because he could have started at Adam if he wanted to, and it makes you wonder. It's interesting that he doesn't start at Adam. I guess that's kind of a foregone conclusion. We're all descended from Adam, but that does always stand out to me. But I think it's because Abraham and David are the more direct connections to the prophecies of who Jesus is, right? Like, both of those characters, those are the first real main prophecies given to humanity about Jesus, right? Is that through Abraham and his descendants, or descendant, depending on the that all people will be saved. Yeah. He started at Abraham because Abraham is the start of Israel, and Abraham is that first prophecy, right? Like, through Abraham, all people will be saved. That's the first, like, messianic prophecy of sorts, the first promise about Jesus' coming. And then the second real one is David, right? David stands out as, when God says it's through David's descendants will come the king that, saves the whole world and whose reign will never end. Let's just kind of go back through these lines. So let's read the first two verses again and see if we can take anything else out of them. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. So did you notice there what name he uses for Abraham? I think sticks out as well, right? The son of Abraham, not the son of Abram. I think Abraham almost always is called Abraham after the fact, but I do wonder if there's some kind of meaning there. What is Abraham's name? Is what, the father of nations is the meaning of Abraham's name? Is that correct, Ben? I see you're on the chat. Yeah, the father of many nations. Abram's name meaning exalted father. I think that is kind of like even more proof of what you had just said, Ben. Like, he started Abraham because Abraham is the father of nations. Abraham is the start of Israel. And I think it's interesting that that's the name we choose, because the name Abram, exalted father, sounds like it might be meaning that as like exalting God as father. I'm not sure about that. Yeah, and it's like a reverse of, instead of saying God is the exalted father, it's Abraham is the father of many nations. And I think that's an interesting connection too, because the other father of many nations is God. And so like the two people who Jesus's genealogy go straight to, who he is the direct descendants of, is Abraham and God. And I think that's an interesting point. Not to say that Abraham is like God, but it's an interesting thing. The other thing that's noteworthy still is just that it's naming characters that we know, right? Like Isaac and Jacob and Judah. Like, and think about those characters. Jacob and Judah, like, are kind of a little, I don't know, sketchy. I don't know. They didn't seem to be the most upright characters through their whole life. Like, that's not who you would pick if you were just a normal person, right? Like Jacob is Esau's younger brother, right? He's the trickster. And then Judah, was Judah? He wasn't the oldest son, I don't think. No, Judah was not the oldest son. And so Judah also is really like an interesting choice. Like, he's not who you would think it would be. You would think it would be the oldest, who was Reuben the oldest, or was it Simeon? I think it was Simeon. But like, even if not those two, you think it would be Levi, maybe, like the leader of the priests or something, or even Joseph. But Judah seems like kind of random almost. And I think Judah doesn't even have a great record. Isn't Judah one of the ones who was pushing to throw Joseph in the well? Unless I'm misremembering. I'm pretty sure Judah was one of the ones who was pushing for that. And he was the one too who, I think, I can't remember specifically. Well, if you just read the next verse too, it even comes to a bigger... Was Judah the one who wanted to save him? I thought that was Reuben. Okay, let's... Ben, you're on the chat. Let's research here. Who wanted to save Joseph? I really thought it was Reuben and Judah. Okay. No, it was Judah who proposed they sold him. So yeah, so Judah still doesn't come out of this on a very bright look. It almost feels even worse that Judah's like, he's not even the one who's just like angry. He's the one who's like, oh, we can like turn this for profit. Like, he's just selfish like that. Like, I don't think it paints Judah in any better of a light that he's like, let's sell him. I don't think that's a better look, to be honest. It's yeah, because Judah's the one who devises the whole plan too, I think, with like, let's kill a ram and paint his clothes and stuff. I think Judah is like kind of the mastermind behind most of this. And then, yeah, if you read the next passage, right, it's Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, right? And that's the first of the ladies who get mentioned. It's interesting. I don't know if that's something you caught. It's interesting that there's 3 women, right? 3. Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, who are mentioned in this passage. 3 different ones. And Tamar and Judah is already not a great look for Judah. Because I'm trying to remember exactly how the story goes. I think Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law? Yeah, so Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law. Yeah, and was married to Judah's eldest son. And then a bunch of shenanigans happened, and Judah's sons died, and then no one else would take Tamar to marry him, and she hatched this weird plot and ended up with Judah as her husband. Like, and it does not paint Judah in a very good light. The story really doesn't at all. And so it's interesting that he is the one through whom Jesus's genealogy comes, right? Anything else we can kind of parse out from those first 3 verses? To be honest, not really anything else that sticks out to me. Why does he mention Perez and Zerah? Why is it both of them? Do you have any insight on that, Ben? Or anybody in the chat? Why is Zerah mentioned? I don't know. That's right. They were twins. Yeah, so they were twins, yeah. Still, wait, but that still doesn't explain it, because Isaiah, or Esau doesn't get mentioned. Was Zerah ever named? What? Why is Zerah mentioned? The Zerahites? Why? Yeah, I think it's just because he's a twin. Are you sure that's the same Zerah? Because I think there's also another Zerah. He was the commander of the army. Which army, though? Oh, the Judean army? Oh, that's interesting. That's actually kind of fascinating, if so. But it really doesn't help answer the question as to why he gets mentioned. I think it... Was it... Different Zerahs, yeah. Did Tamar marry Zerah as... Who was Tamar married to? Tamar was first married to and then Onan, and then I think Judah, and then Tamar and Judah had Zerah and Perez. Okay, so yeah, I think Zerah stands out. He doesn't really seem like he had to be named, but I think probably because they were twins that came out by the same time. That's interesting though. The next verse, I'll go ahead and read the next, it's like 2.5 verses. Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. So what stands out to us from these next 3 passages, the next 3 verses? Kind of interested in seeing if any of you have any real takeaways at the start. There are kind of 2 main things two main things that stick out to me here. By the way, I'll just take this moment to say welcome everybody who's here. I don't know how many of them how many of you there are, but welcome nonetheless. Sorry if the stream started a bit later than you expected. I had some slight technical difficulties, but here we are. So yeah, the two main things that stick out to me about these next three verses is the two women that are named, right? It's Rahab and Ruth. And I think it's also how early in the lineage Boaz shows up. I think I somehow always forget that Boaz is Rahab's son. Somehow I always forget about that. Like that the Boaz and Ruth story was like early Israel history, like that was when they were first becoming a nation and stuff. It is kind of interesting. I also think it's interesting, like this Salmon character, the Salmon guy who is the father of Boaz, like I don't think we hear his story about how he and Rahab met and why he took her to be his wife, right? Salmon isn't mentioned. He wasn't mentioned in the Old Testament, was he? I don't know if anybody in the chat knows. Yeah, I don't think he has any other real mentions. He gets mentioned a few other times in genealogies, I'm sure, right? I think he gets mentioned at the beginning of Ruth, but I don't think we know who Salmon is. So it's interesting that he was willing to take Rahab as his wife. Is a pretty interesting thing. Like it kind of makes him stand out as a character that like I sort of wish we knew more about Salmon, you know, like what his motivations were for that. But the more interesting thing is that Rahab is this is another person in Jesus's genealogy who has a somewhat colored and sketchy history, right? Like this is another person. This time it's a former prostitute / innkeeper who is a Gentile from Jericho, like one of the not one of the best places to be from in the Bible, and who joins Israel after letting two spies into her house and hiding them, and she's spared, and like she ends up becoming Jesus's mother. Like it's kind of crazy to think about, like what if Rahab hadn't let the spies in, you know, like, or like the reason she was spared was partly because to save her family. She could have been married beforehand. No, because I mean maybe to somebody else, but she obviously married Salmon after the fact because Salmon was an Israelite. So that's actually an interesting point, is that she could have been married beforehand, which raises tricky questions. Because she was a prostitute, I'm going to think probably not married, or if she was married, it was like a relationship that got cut off, like kind of thing. Like not a real marriage. I don't know. Yeah, but it's just interesting that to think about like how her story gets connected into this larger narrative. And I think it's one of those really cool examples of how I think Rahab's story in a lot of ways is like a really cool example of how I mean, for one thing, how no one is never too far gone, right? But also how God can use anybody to do great things. How just doing the smaller things can have a huge impact. Like, it's not like we don't know exactly what her life story was like, but it wasn't like she did anything. I mean, what she did was great, but it wasn't like she did something tremendous. She saved these spies, admitted that she wanted their help or whatever, and she was spared, ended up getting married to an Israelite, and that alone was enough, like, for her to be seen as right in God's eyes, was just helping the spies and taking the first step. And we don't know her whole story, but it's interesting that it didn't take a lot from her, if that makes sense. But then the second main thing that immediately sticks out is the other woman in this, right? Boaz and Ruth. And I think it's very similar story with Ruth, once again, to Rahab. This is another Gentile woman who, her history is a lot better than Rahab's, but even still, she was probably seen as an outcast when she joined the Israelites. And this is another woman who joined the chosen people, joined Israel, and is now a part of Jesus's lineage. And it's fascinating that I think it stands again, like, that Boaz took Ruth in. And there's a really interesting parallel to when Salmon took in Rahab, and it definitely has something of a, I don't know, you get the picture that even this early on, that this family felt somewhat unique, that Salmon was willing to take in Rahab, and Boaz seemed to, like, have that same spirit and learn that same lesson, in a sense, that he then took in Ruth. And I think it instantly points to the fact that Jesus is also here for the Gentiles. I think it's one of the sadder things about the Israelites' story is that they seem to miss the mark, in that one of the things they were there for was showing the other nations how to live and possibly bringing people in. And instead they set out to do as much as they could in the end to push people out. And I think it's interesting that Jesus is kind of the fulfillment of this, of his bride, the church, is from all different areas of life, But the final culmination of this passage, it sticks out like a sore thumb, is the father of David, the king. And I think that is, we already hit on it a lot, why that's so important. But I think there's even more, the parallel between Jesus as king and David as king. It's interesting that this first section of people ends with the king, David, right? It begins with Abraham and ends with David. And I think, as we'll see in the end, it's interesting that Jesus is the one who ends the genealogy as a whole, the ultimate David, in a sense, as one might say. So I don't really see much else to glean out of this passage. I think we're ready to move on to the next one. So yeah, there we go. We're already one down, 2 more to go. We're probably not going to get through the whole genealogy of Jesus, but that's okay. Let's jump right into the next section. So then, let's actually like read it all as one. Let's backtrack. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Or King David, depending on the version. So then the next one. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam the father of Abijah. Abijah the father of Asa. Asa the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram. Jehoram the father of Uzziah. Uzziah the father of Jotham. Jotham the father of Ahaz. Ahaz the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah the father of Manasseh. Manasseh the father of Amon. Amon the father of Josiah. Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. So what sticks out to us about these next few verses, besides the fact that it's long and there's a lot of names to pronounce? What else really jumps out here? I think the fact that it's interesting, just starting at the top, at the end of verse 6. It's interesting that the way it describes Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. That's an interesting construction of that sentence, right? Like, that's not exactly the way I would structure it, right? It seems like a roundabout way of saying what he's saying. And I'll look over here. Yeah. Even in my Greek, an earlier version, just to make sure, it's structured that same way, of whose mother was, in the Greek it's even stricter, of whose mother was the wife of Uriah, and not even had been. And I think that is big, actually. I actually much prefer the Greek version, who, by the wife of Uriah, because that really sharply lets you know of something. That brings very much to the forefront, to the focus, what her name is Bathsheba. It tells you instantly what Bathsheba's story was about. It reminds you very clearly of David's sin there, right? Like, it doesn't skirt around that fact at all. It brings it to the forefront very clearly, right? Whose mother had been Uriah's wife. The father of Solomon was a different man's wife, right? Like, this is an affair now thrown into Jesus' genealogy, as well as all the other stuff that's happened with Tamar and Rahab and Ruth. Now, it's interesting that all of the women, for some reason, in Jesus' genealogy, I don't know what I to take by this, but it's interesting how all of them really stand out in the genealogy. They all tell us something very important about Jesus and what his genealogy tells us. And this is another example of how even the broken certain circumstances, how God can use even even sins and wrongdoings to farther his kingdom. Like, it's interesting. One thing I never thought of, it's fun to imagine, right, what would the genealogy of Jesus be like? What would the story of that time be like if David hadn't married Bathsheba and had a son with her? If he hadn't had Solomon, right? What would it have, like, it's interesting to think about, like, if he hadn't had Solomon, surely somebody else would have been, took in Solomon's place, essentially, would have been the one who fathered Jesus's genealogy. But it's really cool that God even used that brokenness to farther his plan. And I think what I just said, I don't want it to come off the wrong way. It sounded like I was almost saying, like, oh, it's a good thing they sinned because then they had Solomon. If they didn't have Solomon, we wouldn't have had Jesus. No. I think it's the exact opposite. I think it's if they hadn't sinned, Solomon, whether it would have been one of David's earlier sons or whether he would have had another son by his actual correct wife, that person, I think, would have been an even more whole version of the same story. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten Solomon corrupted at the end of his life. Maybe we wouldn't have had all of these pains that we saw through the long list of kings that Israel and Judea struggle with. Maybe we wouldn't have had the split off of the kingdom at that point. But I think even though David broke the plan, God still pieced it back together, and I think that's really cool. The other main thing, one thing is that it's cool to see all the kings that are in Jesus' genealogy. I think it's one of those things that I always thought was odd, was how is Joseph not considered a man of higher standing than he is, when he has, like, the full repertoire of kings in his bloodline, right? Like, I always found that really odd that he was just a carpenter. I think he did have good standing and, like, good name and stuff. There might have even been a verse about that. We might find it as we keep reading Matthew. But that always struck me, was like, it's interesting how this random carpenter is really connected to David and all of these kings, and how I think what it tells you more than anything else is how all these kings and all their schemes and all their tryings to make their names great and their lineage stay strong, they came to ruin in the end, and they were brought so low as to be prisoners in exile, as the final verse states, and even just carpenters. I think that's a really strong point of, like, our ambitions are so frail, that even though we have all these crazy ideas, has the music suddenly gotten really, really loud? Even though we have all these crazy ideas and stuff, it all comes to naught in the end. That all of our plans to try to make our name great and to build our lineage and such and forth, and that was a big like thing for them, I think, was, making my name great and my house great and my lineage great. All of that came to naught, and I think it was only because of God and because of his divine intervention in Mary and Joseph's story that David's line did mean something. Like, if it hadn't been for Jesus, David's line would have ended in nothing. And I think that's very telling, you know. The other main thing that sticks out, if you pay close attention to these names, you'll notice some of them, a few are on the good side, right? There's Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat is an interesting character. I like Jehoshaphat, but I don't think he was the greatest king. I think he had a good heart, but he wasn't the wisest, and he made some bad choices, right? Then there's probably the highest pinnacle in this whole lineage is probably Hezekiah, right? Hezekiah, who he has a very up and down story, right? He struggles with pride and with money and with with greed and with all these different things, depression, even anxiety, but through that all, his relationship with God only grows stronger, and he is the one who saves the kingdom of Israel from the Assyrian Empire. But there's also and there's Josiah as well. Let's not forget about Josiah, another great one. I almost missed him. What was he, like the child king who reinstated God's laws, but it was too little too late. Unless I'm mistaking who that is. That's the right Josiah, correct? Yeah, I think it is. But for just as many good characters as there are in Jesus' genealogy, and even the good characters have lots of flaws and struggles, especially Hezekiah and Jehoshaphat. For just as many good characters, there are way more bad characters. There's Manasseh, Asa. I don't think, unless I'm misremembering once again, I don't think Asa was a very good character. Manasseh was a terrible character. Jeconiah and all his brothers were doing who knows what. There's times of political unrest, and it all culminates in the exile to Babylon. Is another it's like everywhere you look, you can't stop finding people who weren't good people in this genealogy, and it's really cool how there's like this parallel of these are some great heroes and important people, David and Abraham and Solomon, and there's these promises and stuff, but at the same time there's so much brokenness like interspersed within that. I think it's a good example of the human condition of what life is like for us, you know. There's a lot of good, but there's a lot of bad, and I think it's really beautiful the way that God still used that to further his plan. You guys have any other insights on this? These, what is it, 4 verses? Oh, 5 verses. 5.5 actually. Yeah, I don't think I realized I was cutting verse 6 in half. That's something that's interesting. In the NIV version, there is a space between the first half of verse 6 that ends with David the king, and the second half, which is David fathering Solomon by the wife of Uriah. That is because, as we will find out at the end of this, that is because that's because Matthew cut his genealogy into 3 pieces at the end. He says there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and then 14 from Babylon to Jesus. And which we'll talk more about that when we get to it, but I just did want to let you all know, yes, I did cut verse 6 in half. I didn't realize I was doing that, but that's because it is cut that way, kind of in Matthew's own words, you know, which I care much more about that than the superficial verses that were later imposed upon it. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump to what are we at right now? 50. Let's go ahead and jump to the last section. Or maybe I will do some. I just want to make sure I don't get this video like cut short. Okay, I think we should be fine. So yeah, let's go ahead and let's do the last part of Jesus's genealogy. And this is verses 12 through 17. After the exile to Babylon, which... Okay, hold up, wait a second. That already kind of throws me for a light loop. After the exile, like the whole exile. I think we're gonna have to talk to about that, but let me finish reading first, and that already jumps out to me. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel the father of Abihud, the father of Eliakim, the father of Azor, the father of Zadok, the father of Akim, the father of Elihud, the father of Eleazar, the father of Mathon, the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Whoa, so if the last section seemed to be a little bit bland, there are a lot of things that jump out to me about this one right off the bat. So many different things. What do you guys notice? So let's talk about the exile to Babylon. But if you guys have any thoughts about this one, go ahead and message it. But the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, what does he mean by that? Let me check my Greek interlinear direct translations to see if it offers any insight. Okay, it might. The Greek strict translation says, and after the deportation to Babylon. And I just noticed something else. So that alone, the word deportation, makes me think that this is the fact that it's not capitalized, the fact that in the Greek it's deportation. Yeah. The exile is the moment of being exiled, not the entire 77 year period. That was throwing me for a loop for a second, because I think it is sometimes referred to as the exile to Babylon, like as in a thing, like a time period, as you said, Benjamin. But the other thing that makes it clear is that, going back to the previous slide, and Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon, flopping back over, it's Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. So yeah, it's Jeconiah's son. We didn't skip 2 generations while we were in exile or anything. This is probably a good time to note that Matthew did probably skip generations. Right? Like, it may not have been, in fact, it certainly wasn't an actual straight 14 generations. I think from Abraham to David was 14, and it seems that Matthew kind of patterned off of that and tried to make a nice, neat list. For a lot of different reasons. I think one is just that there's a very nice structure and wholeness to it, and also that in an actual practical sense, 14, 14, 14 would be really nice for like memorizing this, you know, or it just makes it look better on the page and stuff, you know, there's a nice form there. Another reason, because he literally draws the fact of it, though, it does make it seem like there's more to it than that. Potentially some people have said that it was to try to draw notice to the fact that like God was in control of it all, right? That God had like that there was a plan the whole time, you know, 14, 14, 14, like there was a focus. And then of course every time you see a number in the Bible, you start to say to yourself, does this number mean anything? It's interesting because 14 generations 14 as a number doesn't seem to come up that often. It's not a particularly important number in the same way that 7 or 3 or 12 or even 13 are, right? 3 is the Trinity, the triune. 7 is the complete, the whole, the perfect number. You have 12 as the 12 tribes of Israel. And then even 13, like in later Christian theology, 13 is the unlucky number. It's the amount of people at the Last Supper. 14 is just a number. You know, it doesn't mean very much in the Bible. I mean, it's 2 sets of 7. So you could stretch that and say that this is another like 7 thing. It's another example of completeness and perfectness, which is a really interesting reading. If you cut it up that way, it's 6 sets of 7 generations. And that's, you know, it's interesting, but the fact that Matthew doesn't separate it that way, he doesn't cut it up to 6 sets of 7, he does 14. Somebody, I was reading up on this a little bit beforehand, somebody has made the connection that 14, if you take David's letters as like numbers, like if you count the letters, like, you know, the way you do with like an alphabet, David's name does equal 14. So that's interesting. I don't know what it tells us. You know, whether you want to say that God did set it up that way as 14 generations to David, it's a really cool connection. But overall, the 14 generations from Abraham to David, the way I would lean is probably that it's mostly just a way to bring attention to the complete picture that like God had control on things the whole time. But I think there also is something to like it really closely, like even more so, connects Jesus back to Abraham and David in that right, like David is at the end of the first group and David and Abraham are the end and beginning of the first group, and Jesus is the end of the last group and the beginning of the next one, you know, like what happens next after Jesus. Jesus is the father of many, and that's another fun connection back to Abraham. His name being Abraham, not Abram, the father of many, the father of nations. That is who Jesus now is. Jesus is King David, in a sense, the king, and he is also the father of many. And so I think that more than anything else to me is what it is trying to connect, what it's trying to draw. So let's kind of zoom back out, though. We kind of jumped around a little bit. So yeah, after the exile to Babylon is just meaning after the moment. Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abihud, Abihud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Akim, Akim the father of Elihud, Elihud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Mathan, Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. most of those names don't mean much to us. Most of those names are just names, frankly. I've heard the names Zerubbabel. I've heard the name Eliakim, the name Eliezer, but I don't know if we get anything about these Zerubbabels and Eliakims specifically. Does anybody in the chat know? Is this Zerubbabel known? I feel like Zerubbabel is the one that I'm thinking maybe most of all. Okay, yes. Okay, it looks like it could be. So I just did a quick search. Yes, so I had heard this name before, and I knew where I had. Yes, that's right. In Ezra, Zerubbabel was appointed to be leader of the Jews who returned to Jerusalem. I did remember that. I had forgotten. Yes, so this is that Zerubbabel, almost certainly. So yeah, it's cool that Zerubbabel takes over. He continues still that leadership role. That's actually a fascinating parallel, is paralleling Zerubbabel and Jesus, as being the shepherd who has to guide his people back to their place beside God is a really fascinating parallel. I don't know, I don't remember the whole story of Zerubbabel, if he did a good job or a bad job, what exactly the specifics there were, but the rest of those names don't mean too much until we get down to Joseph. And I find really fascinating the construction, the sentence structure with which Matthew gives us Joseph's and Mary's and Jesus's names. He does a very good job here, of really laying it out so there's no theological mishap or controversy, or the right word would be what's the word when the text contradicts itself? Contradiction, but there's a better word. I can't remember what it is for some reason. Anachronism. There aren't any anachronisms here, right? Because up until now, we have been reading it as the father of Joseph, who was the father of Jesus, is the way you would expect the structure to go. That's the way it normally goes. And maybe you would get, if you go back to the first sections, right, you would get a mother in here would be Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, right? You would say the mother after the fact. But this is unique this is Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And it's just, it's a nice little just so people don't get confused, Matthew doesn't say that Jesus is Joseph's son, because he really isn't. It's a little complicated, but I think it's noteworthy for a few different reasons. I'm trying to figure out how I want to say this. What this means. It keeps you from thinking, if he had just said the father of Joseph, the father of Jesus, whose mother was Mary, it would get much more complicated, right? And people would be like, okay, but his father really isn't Joseph, and yada yada yada. It's complicated. This is the right genealogy. What you probably are questioning now is okay, then why did we get the whole genealogy of Joseph if he's not really Jesus' dad? What does any of this mean? It doesn't tell us anything, really. No. Joseph's genealogy is still massively important, because that is, for two different reasons. I think that is, Joseph is the inheritance that Jesus is gaining, right? That inheritance as, that's the house that he takes when he is born and grows up, right? I'm sure there was probably that moment when Joseph gave him his blessing in a, a la Isaac and Jacob style thing. I don't know for sure, but I'm sure that is like the inheritance Jesus was taking, was as a son of David and as a carpenter, right? The second thing, the second main reason is that, there's all those passages in the Bible that, when the man takes his wife, they become one. And so it's that Jesus's genealogy is still Joseph's genealogy, because Joseph's and Mary's genealogies are one, essentially. The other thing, who was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah, it's Matthew lays it out right there, right? Like very it seems kind of like all of a sudden, like Jesus, who is called the Messiah, and that next section in 14, from the exile to the Messiah, I think stands out even more so. Messiah means deliverer, right? Messiah means deliverer, anointed one. And I think it's really cool because it goes straight from exile to the anointed one, the deliverer, who will bring them out of exile, both in the technical sense, right? The exile is literal, but it is much more so metaphorical, from exile to deliverance, right? Is what all of human history is. Jesus is taking us out of exile. So overall thoughts on this passage, right? It is, to us, odd to start a story with a genealogy, but it tells us so much right off the bat, if you're paying attention, that it tells us so much about who Jesus is, but much more about who God is, in the way God makes plans and moves through people's lives, and with their help, but also in, I can't believe I'm missing this word, in even though they sin, even though there is so much sin and brokenness, God is still able to move, is very, very beautiful. And I think that's like the perfect illustration of what God is all about and what the New Testament is all about. But then also it very easily relays to us who Jesus is. He is the Father, Jesus and God is the Father of many nations, right? The beginning of this new Israel, this new covenant, right? That's the connection to Abraham, this new beginning. But also he is the king, like King David, who is his covenant, his kingdom, unlike Abraham's, will never end. And the final connection, right? Like, we get connected back to the beginning with Abraham, right? This new covenant. We get connected back to David, right? The king. And then we also get connected back to the exile in the deliverer from the exile, in the Messiah, the anointed one. And I think that's a really, really cool and poetic thing that he did there. So that's pretty much it. That's all I've got on this one. If anybody has any other comments, go ahead and put them down there. But yeah, the genealogy of Jesus is one of those things that's so fascinating, but also it is somewhat it's deeper than you would think it is, but it still is a genealogy. So I think I will be excited. Next week we're going to be getting into his birth, right? And everything connected with that. So that's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. I'm probably going to try to keep this stream to every Monday, right? So probably it'll start being like every Monday around 6:30 or 7. This time I decided to do it a little earlier. I might even do Monday around like 8 or 9. I'll have to think about that. But yeah, that's the end of this one. Thank you guys for coming out. Thank you to everybody who watches after the fact. I'm doing this is my first stream, and then I'm doing another stream this Friday on the Lord of the Rings. So kind of the similar vibe as this, but Lord of the Rings. The end goal is to have have a large enough community of people in the chat so that I can kind of converse with them back and forth, and they can give me suggestions and information about what the text means to them and what insights they see, because I think that's one of the coolest things about this is that we all see very different things. In the Bible we see very different things for more spiritual reasons, right? We have different gifts. Some of us might be gifted in that moment with different ideas, but also for similar reasons to as you would in the Lord of the Rings, because we come from different backgrounds and ages and places, and our minds just work differently. And so it's really cool when we can bounce ideas off of each other. But this is also just a fun exercise for me personally to study texts, read books slowly, as the description of the channel says. So thank you all for being here, and I will hope to see you this Friday and then also next Monday. So until then.